Step into a world of cobalt dreams, where the boundaries between reality and imagination finally begin to fade away into the blue. Our stories capture the ethereal beauty of the subconscious mind in high definition. Subscribe today and let your imagination take flight with our newest cinematic series.
The house cost me $387,000. 34 years running the parts counter at a Caterpillar dealership in Fresno, California. Every morning at 5:15, coffee in a thermos, 40-minute drive down Highway 99. I never called in sick. Not once in 34 years. When I retired, my supervisor Don shook my hand and said he'd never replaced me, and he meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. I bought the house in Sycamore Ridge, a small community about 20 miles outside Asheville, North Carolina, in the spring of my 63rd year. 3 bedrooms, a covered front porch, and 4 acres of land that backed up against a creek you could hear from the kitchen window when you left it open. The real estate agent called it a forever home. I didn't correct her, but I'd already been calling it that in my head for 2 years before I ever set foot inside it. My wife Linda passed 8 years ago. Breast cancer, diagnosed in October, gone by March. We never had children of our own, but her sister Paulette had 2 boys, Derek and Connor. They called me Uncle Ray growing up. I coached Derek's Little League team one summer when he was 11. Connor used to come over on Saturdays and help me change the oil on whatever I was driving that year. Good kids, both of them. Or so I believed. I moved into the Sycamore Ridge house on a Tuesday in April. I spent the first week just walking the property, learning where the sun hit the porch in the afternoon, where the deer came through in the early morning, how cold the creek ran. I didn't have a plan for any of it. That was the point. For 34 years I had a plan every single day. Now I didn't need one. Paulette called on my 3rd Saturday there. We talked for about an hour. She asked about the house, the neighbors, whether I'd met anyone on the road yet. I told her about the retired couple, 2 properties over, Jim and Helen, who'd brought over a pie the day I moved in. She laughed and said that sounded like something out of a movie. I told her it felt that way too. Then she mentioned Derek. She said he'd been going through a rough patch. He was 31, living in Charlotte, working in sales for a software company. She said the job wasn't going well. His girlfriend Brianna had expensive tastes and a talent for encouraging Derek's more impractical ideas. Paulette didn't say that second part directly, but she didn't need to. I'd met Brianna twice at family gatherings and formed my own conclusions. I told Paulette I was sorry to hear it and asked if there was anything I could do. She said no. She just wanted to mention it. I thought that was the end of it. Derek called the following Wednesday. He opened with small talk, asked about the house, said he'd love to come see it sometime. I told him the door was always open. Then, about 15 minutes into the conversation, after he'd warmed me up sufficiently, he mentioned that he and Brianna had been looking into some investment opportunities. I said that sounded interesting and waited. He told me that short-term vacation rentals in the Asheville area were generating serious income. He said the market was hot, that properties in communities like Sycamore Ridge were booking out weeks in advance, that people drove up from Charlotte and Atlanta and Raleigh just to spend a weekend in the mountains. I told him I'd noticed a few vacation rental signs driving in. He said my property would be perfect. 4 acres, creek access, covered porch. He said a place like mine could bring in anywhere from $4,000 to $6,000 a month on the right platform. I asked him what platform he had in mind. He said Airbnb and VRBO. Maybe both. He said Brianna had been researching it for months and had contacts who managed properties in the area. He said all I'd have to do was let him set it up and he'd handle everything. Cleaning crews, guest communication, maintenance. He said I'd barely notice the guests were there. I asked where I'd stay during bookings. He said I could use the back bedroom on nights there weren't guests. He said most bookings would be weekends, so I'd have the house to myself most of the week. I want you to understand what he was describing. He was proposing to rent out my home, the home I had purchased with 34 years of my own labor, to strangers on weekends while I moved myself into the smallest room in my own house on a schedule determined by his booking calendar. And he was presenting this as a favor to me. I told him I wasn't interested. He didn't argue. He said he understood, that he just wanted to float the idea, that there was no pressure. He asked about the creek and whether the fishing was any good. We talked for another 10 minutes and hung up. I went back to the porch and sat with my coffee and watched the tree line and thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. He called again 2 weeks later. This time, he had numbers. He'd spoken to a property manager named Greg, who operated 12 rentals in the Asheville area. Greg had walked him through projected occupancy rates, average nightly prices, seasonal adjustments. Derek told me that conservatively, my property could generate $52,000 a year. He said he would take 20% for management and split the rest with me. I asked him to do the math out loud. He said I would receive roughly $41,000 annually. I told him that $52,000 minus 20% was not $41,000 and asked him to try again. There was a pause. He said he'd also need to cover startup costs, photography, platform fees, initial supplies for guests. He said those would come out of the first few months of revenue. I said no. I told him I'd said no the first time, and that hadn't changed. I said I'd bought the property to live in, not to run as a business, and that I wasn't interested in strangers sleeping in my bed while I squeezed into the back room. I told him I appreciated that he was looking for opportunities, but this wasn't one I was going to be part of. He said I was being short-sighted. He said a man my age should be thinking about income, about what happened if my health changed, about whether I'd really thought through the long-term finances of retirement. He said he was trying to help me. I told him I'd managed my finances for 34 years without his help, and I was confident I could continue to do so. He went quiet. Then he said okay. He understood, and we ended the call. I told myself that was really the end of it this time. A month passed. The dogwoods bloomed along the creek, and I spent 3 mornings in a row sitting out back with coffee, watching the deer come through. Jim from next door came by one afternoon and we talked for 2 hours about nothing in particular. I started sleeping past 6 for the first time in my adult life. The property felt like mine. I felt like myself. Then Paulette called. She was gentler about it than Derek had been, but she was making the same argument. She said Derek was struggling, and that I had more space than I needed, and that helping family didn't mean giving anything away, it just meant being flexible. She used that word 3 times. Flexible. I told her I understood Derek was going through a hard time, and that I was sorry for that. I told her I'd already told him no twice and that my answer hadn't changed. I said if Derek needed financial help, I was willing to discuss that separately, but that my home was not available to be rented out to strangers. Paulette got quiet the way people do when they're deciding whether to say the next thing. Then she said that Linda would have wanted me to help family. I stayed on the line for a moment without speaking. Then I said that Linda had also respected other people's boundaries, and that I was going to end the call now. I hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I want to tell you about the week that followed, because it's important for what came later. I called my attorney, a man named Frank Delgado whom I'd used for the house closing and a few other matters over the years. I told him what had been happening. He listened carefully and asked a few questions. He told me that if anyone attempted to list my property on a rental platform without my authorization, it would constitute unauthorized commercial use of my property and potentially fraud. He told me to document every conversation I could remember. He told me to consider security measures. I spent a Saturday at the hardware store. I installed a new deadbolt on the front door with a code only I knew. I put a combination lock on the back gate that led from the driveway to the rear of the property. I purchased 4 security cameras, 2 covering the front approach, 1 on the back porch, 1 on the driveway, and had them set up and running by Sunday evening. All footage went to a cloud account I set up that afternoon. I also hired a local property manager named Susan Teller to have my property officially registered in her management system with explicit documentation that I was the sole owner and that no third-party rental agreements were authorized. Frank helped me draft a short letter to that effect, signed and notarized, filed with the county recorder's office. It took about a week to process. I didn't tell Derek or Paulette any of this. The following Friday evening, I was reading on the front porch when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. Area code 704, which is Charlotte. I answered. A woman's voice asked if this was the Sycamore Ridge property available for booking the weekend of the 14th. I set my book down very carefully. I told her she had the wrong number and asked where she'd found the listing. She said Airbnb. She said she'd been trying to reach the host but hadn't heard back and was following up on a number listed in the property description. I thanked her for calling and told her I was the property owner and that no such listing was authorized and that she should not complete any booking. She was confused but polite. I got her name and contact information before we hung up. I went inside and sat at my computer. It took me about 4 minutes to find it. Derek had listed my property under the name Creekside Retreat, Asheville area, with 17 photographs that he had apparently taken during his visit the previous fall, when I'd shown him around the property, my front porch, my kitchen, my back acreage. There was a description that called it a peaceful mountain getaway with creek access and described the host as a family-oriented property manager with multiple listings in the region. The nightly rate was $220. There were already 3 bookings confirmed. I called Frank at home. He told me to take screenshots of everything immediately and not to contact Derek yet. I did exactly that. Then I called the non-emergency line for the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office and reported an unauthorized commercial listing of my property. The deputy who took my report was thorough and patient and told me to forward the documentation to an email address he gave me. Monday morning, Frank filed for an emergency injunction to have the listing taken down and to prohibit Derek from entering the property or conducting any rental activity. He also contacted Airbnb's legal department directly with my notarized property documentation. The listing was removed by Tuesday afternoon. The injunction hearing was Thursday. Derek showed up with a lawyer, which told me Brianna had been more involved in planning this than I'd originally understood. His attorney argued that Derek had a long-standing family relationship with the property and a reasonable belief that informal permission had been granted. Frank presented the 2 documented phone calls in which I had explicitly refused, the notarized letter on file with the county, and the security camera footage showing Derek on the property the previous fall, taking photographs after I had declined his proposal. The judge granted the injunction before lunch. Derek was ordered to cancel all existing bookings, issue full refunds to the guests, and have no further involvement with the property in any commercial capacity. The 3 guests who'd already booked received their refunds. Derek was responsible for those costs. I heard through Paulette, who called me the following week, that the refunds came to just over $4,000 and that Brianna had left Derek shortly after the hearing. Paulette didn't say this directly either, but I could hear in her voice that she was reassessing some things. I told Paulette I was sorry that it had come to this. I meant it. I didn't want a legal fight with a boy I'd coached Little League. I didn't want to be the reason his relationship ended or his finances got worse. But I had told him no. I had told him twice. I had ended a phone call with his mother over it, and he had photographed my home without my permission and rented it to strangers anyway, and expected that I would either not notice or not do anything about it. Paulette asked if I would consider talking to Derek. I said I would, when he was ready to have a genuine conversation. I haven't heard from him since. That was 7 months ago. The dogwoods are long done now. The leaves have come in full on the oaks along the creek, and the mornings have started getting that particular chill that comes off the water in late September. Jim brought over venison sausage last weekend from a deer he'd taken on his property, and we grilled it on the back porch and talked until it got dark. I still sleep past 6 most mornings. I still hear the creak from the kitchen window when I leave it open. The cameras are still up and they'll stay up. Not because I'm afraid of anything, but because I am a man who spent 34 years making sure the parts were in order before anything went wrong. Old habits don't disappear. They just find new purposes. The house is mine. I paid for it with time I cannot get back, and I intend to spend what time I have left inside it on my own terms. That is not stubbornness. That is not selfishness. That is simply a man knowing what he has earned and being unwilling to pretend otherwise for the comfort of people who never once sat in that Friday morning traffic on Highway 99. The porch faces west. In the evenings, the light comes through the trees at a low angle and turns everything the color of old wood. I sit there most nights with a glass of water or sometimes something stronger, and I listen to the creak and I do not think about much at all. That is exactly what I came here for.